Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be diving into really just the tip of the iceberg of this field or this topic of trauma and nervous system responses because, well, there's a lot to it, and I want to start giving you some information, some understandings, and even some beginner tools to start working with, like what you're gonna understand as little t trauma, which we'll get into. Because here's the thing. Trauma is totally a normal thing to have, part of the human condition, especially in these modern times. And there are different ways of addressing it. So I always highly recommend, getting the help of a therapist or psychologist who specializes in trauma. If you've had like really big trauma that's currently like really part of like an active inhibiting part of your life, right? But there are a couple other things you can do when it comes to trauma, which is one, like totally ignore it, right? Or two, like get to know your own trauma responses and learn how to be with them and work with them in a very caring, conscious way so they aren't the master of you. Right? And ultimately, so over time, you can begin to unloop these, heal these for a better relationship and a better life. That's really what this episode is about. And I'm so happy to have Karen C.L. Anderson here to talk with me today about all of this. Karen C.L. Anderson is a master certified life coach and author who helps women use the troubled relationships they have with their mamas, with their mothers, as a catalyst for growth, wisdom, and creativity. She's the author of many books, including Difficult Mothers, Adult Daughters, A Guide for Separation, Liberation, and Inspiration. So welcome, Karen. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So I'm really interested in what got you into this field of mother-daughter relationship.
Well, I have a mother. And we have a relationship. My mom is still alive. And it has been troubled over the years. I would say, between like 15 and 20 years ago, I kind of really saw it start to not be something that was pleasant, to put it mildly. And then about 10 years ago, things kind of came to a head and I estranged myself from her. And then it was a few years later that I discovered coaching. And of course, I've had therapy and I'm not saying therapy is bad at all, because I have had therapy that has been very helpful and even not right this minute, but, in the past few years, I sometimes have chosen to receive therapy or counseling.
Yes.
But it was when I discovered coaching and some of my mother stuff was sort of coming to a head and like the training. It was in the training, I was receiving coaching and it made such a huge difference in ways that therapy hadn't.
Yes.
And I was like, you know what? I can't keep this to myself. Over the years, it seemed like every woman I spoke to, had some sort of issue with their mom. And so it just, I knew I wasn't the only one.
Definitely not.
Yeah. And so that's how it all sort of started.
Yeah, well, it's an amazing gift that you offer. I find many of my clients, not all, but certainly I hear from a fair amount of them that they've had or that they have troubled relationships with one or both of their parents,
Mm.
and so. And I really think one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because of how you do you work on women's growth through their relationship with their mother, right?
Mm.
And obviously that's very parallel to what I do. And, our relationships in one arena can really be reflected in another arena, right? Meaning like a mother-daughter relationship can also be like a mirror sort of, or at least influence how we might show up in our marriage.
100%.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know my challenging relationship was more with my dad, and I know that there's been a lot of effects of that and reflections of that in my marriage. And so doing a lot of work that I did around my relationship with my dad was tremendously impactful on my relationship with my husband.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I've heard other women say this, and I know it was my experience as well. I'm married now for 24 years, but I had a first marriage. And in hindsight, I'm like, oh, I married my mother. A lot of people say that they marry their fathers.
Right.
And I've heard other women say the same thing. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. That's a good one. People should like question that. Did I marry my mom? Oh, well, good. Well, I'm excited to hear where we go today with this conversation. My first question for you is, just maybe a generalized some thoughts on what leads to trauma and what the different types are in the way you think about it.
Well, as I said in our pre-conversation, I am not by any means like the expert.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of reading. I've done some courses and studies, and have taken classes with people. And I would love to just mention some of their names.
Yeah.
Ahead of time, if you don't mind.
Of course, please.
Somebody who has been very impactful, and she has a book that just came out. Her name is Kimberly Johnson. And she has a book that came out earlier this year called Call of the Wild: How We Heal Trauma, Awaken Our Power, and Use It for Good. Resmaa Menakem and his book, My Grandmother's Hands.
Yes.
Dr. Gabor Mate is somebody who, and he has a film out now called The Wisdom of Trauma. And then Stephen Porges, of course, with his polyvagal theory.
Yes.
And there's more than that, I'm sure, but those are sort of like the ones who, I've learned the most from, and, have absorbed the most from. So with that said, I have written down some definitions of trauma that I like. And, I think a lot of times people think of trauma as, okay, that's what happens when you're in a war, or when you're in a car accident, or, physical violence is visited upon you, that kind of thing. And that's true. That is trauma. That's what is often referred to as big T trauma.
Yes.
And then small T trauma. And again, like, I'm not even sure I have the right definition for this, but like, I was talking earlier about body image. And small T trauma, like, I recognize that I used to sort of traumatize myself over and over and over again every time I got on the scale.
Totally.
Right. That was a small T trauma.
Yeah.
And
I love that.
And it's the other thing that's interesting to me is to realize that what one person experiences as traumatic is not necessarily what somebody else. So like, and it's so funny, you often hear siblings talking about growing up in the same family, and they're like, oh, remember blah, blah, blah. And it was so horrible. And then the other sibling's like, what? I don't remember that,
Yes. Yeah. That's really interesting. Before we started talking, I was actually thinking about how there's a way in which we not like we traumatize ourselves like on purpose, or it's like we're
Right.
bad because we do it. But it's like, I was thinking about one of my self-created traumas sort of was around like the way I used to think about grades in school. Like I couldn't get less than an A, and it's showed up in my career now, right? It's like sometimes I still have to like start to kind of panic when I sit down in front of like to write something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, it's again, for some people, like, you may have had an experience in school where the teacher looked at you funny, or, you got a B when you thought you were going to get an A.
Yeah.
And like somebody else would be like,
no problem.
But for you, it was too much. This leads into like one of the definitions, right? And I don't know who coined this one, but to anything that's too much, too soon, or too fast, for your particular nervous system to process.
Yes. Yeah. And I want to just pause you there on that, because I think that's so good. And what just came into my mind as you read it this time was, I don't know how much you know about highly sensitive people, but as highly sensitive people, we have nervous systems that take things in deeper than like the rest of the 80% of people. And so for us, and this is what they've studied, is that highly sensitive people, we reach too much, too fast, too soon, quickly, more quickly than other people.
Yes.
And this is one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about trauma. and I also like just to like make sure I pull this piece out is because you mentioned the little T trauma. So that again, like it doesn't have to be this giant, terrible event that happened, but it can be these lots of little things throughout our regular day, right? Or our regular week. And it's so common in our fast-paced, kind of, I want to say crazy society. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how old you are, but I remember very well the time before the internet.
Yeah.
And the time before social media. And I absolutely see a correlation between anxiety or
yes.
I don't even want to necessarily call it trauma, but trauma response maybe to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the three types of trauma that I've sort of heard discussed are developmental trauma, right?
Yes.
Which can just be chronic neglect, or just things that you didn't get as a child that were sort of basic essentials, so like emotional well-being, nourishment essentials, right? And then of course, like the big T trauma where something terrible happens, right? Car accident, etc. But then there's just the chronic stress trauma, right? So many of us walk around with that going on, and we don't know because we didn't necessarily have a terrible, terrible thing happen. Or maybe we had, like I had multiple car accidents when I was a kid, but like it's a lot of that can be really jacking up our nervous systems and causing a lot of, like you said, anxiety or just reactivity or responses to things that are kind of intense.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, just like on a side note, speaking of like not realizing that something was a thing, it wasn't until fairly recently, like in the past 5 years. And when I say this, it's as I say it, it always sounds a little funny to me. But like I didn't realize that I was actually sort of profoundly neglected as a small child. Yeah. And I don't mean that I wasn't taken care of, but and I don't know if I've ever chosen specifically to identify as highly sensitive. I think I am.
Yeah. Me.
And and it's not, oh, my mother was this horrible mother, right? There was just a lot of things going on at that time.
Yes.
I didn't have siblings. Yeah. And I was alone a lot.
Yeah.
And it was probably too little, too late, too slow for me.
Yes. That's another piece of the definition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly. One of the things I've learned about this too is that developmental trauma it's not like it comes from necessarily from like a bad parent who did awful things to you. It's more like they were dysregulated, right? They
yes.
were dealing with their own stuff and were potentially somewhat absent, either like not physically necessarily, but emotionally to some degree.
Yeah. I mean, there's also what's considered intergenerational trauma and cultural
Yes.
trauma.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, what's interesting about all of this is there are so many ways to discuss trauma, and there's so many definitions of trauma, and it comes from so many places. One of the definitions that I want to share is, just to clarify, is that trauma is not the event.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's the body's protective response to the event or the series of events, right? Like the body perceiving potential danger or actual danger. And it's also really interesting just to know that like animals, when in nature and not sort of like suppressed by ways that they're supposed to behave, like humans have these ideas of how they're supposed to be and act. Like animals have in general, they have a natural sort of instinct to discharge stressful experiences. So like big T traumas, chronic trauma, like chronic stress traumas, like littler events that add up, like they naturally and immediately are able to usually discharge that stress from their system. But for many humans, and sometimes for animals too, but it can get locked into our body because we don't naturally discharge the stress. And that locked into our body thing that drives our reactions and locks us into reactions that can really be out of proportion to the actual threat. In other words, it really can make us misinterpret what's going on out there as a threat. And it can kind of run that programming on a dime, like at the drop of a hat. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite questions to ask clients is not only what danger might your system be perceiving, but, in relation to your mom, right? What danger or threat what might she be perceiving? And like it was funny when I figured that out, like, oh wait, my mom is like, there's a trauma response there.
Yes.
On her side too.
Totally. Totally. I think that's such an important recognition. It's not just like of your own, but also this other being, right? Yes. Who's like, as a mom, we may like idealize her or think she's supposed to be so like motherly and have it all together, but like she's a human too.
100%.
And I definitely make sure to talk about that with my clients too. It's like your husband also has his trauma.
Yeah, he's a human being.
Right.
I don't know if it's fair or right or accurate, but it's gotten to the point where I'm like, I think pretty much if you're human, you've experienced some trauma.
I agree with you. That's my perception as well. It's like living in this world. I mean, I think about it, like if you zoom all the way out and you think about like the universe, right? Like the universe and the earth and all the planets and all these things were created in violence.
Yes.
Right. So like think about like the Big Bang and like all the explosions and the earth forming like fires and volcanoes and floods. I just think it's so interesting to think about like we've evolved alongside violence, and violence is everywhere, whether that's these like mini little like the onslaught on social media that we might, or the news, right? Or like, our parents like neglecting us somewhat, or right, like there's just quote unquote violence kind of coming from everywhere. And so being a human being means that we probably have some degree of trauma.
Yeah. And I think too, what's interesting about talking about it is, I like talking about it this way because I don't want to say normalizes, but I guess normalizes or, is like, oh, I think one of the things that makes trauma so difficult to talk about, or people have been up until now, not really wanting to talk about it, is that they perceive that someone who's experienced trauma is weak.
Yes.
Or that there's something wrong with that person.
Yeah.
Right. Or, and it's like, no, we all have it, right? We all have experienced some form of it. And, and like the other thing too, it's like, I don't think we can prevent trauma from happening.
Yes.
But what we can do is make trauma repair and healing more normal, like more, like, of course, this is what we just do. We just do, like, it's like getting a checkup, right? Or clean, right? It's just part of the normal, like, this is what we do to take care of ourselves.
Right. And I love that. It reminds me of what I heard you say on your interview with Simone, which was Simone, by the way, everybody listening, is one of our coaches, our co-coach. But you talked about, right, healing trauma, or trauma is it's not our fault that if it happens to us, but it's our responsibility. It's the responsibility to take care of ourselves or heal it in ourselves. And I love that so much. And I think, sort of to extend that a little bit, it's like the being responsible for it, for healing it, for working with it ourselves, doesn't have to be a terrible burden or a terribly bad thing, or like make us feel like we're, like self-pitying ourselves around it. It's like, I think that too is a part of a healthy opportunity, and a normal, maybe almost an expectation that we could ideally have, as a natural way of being a modern human and taking care of ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, one of my, and this might sound strange, but one of my favorite subjects is shame.
Yeah.
And, the shame around that's like, I think there's a lot of shame around trauma.
Yes.
And I think I know for a fact that when we feel shame, that the experience of that, it can be painful enough to trigger a trauma response. Like shame is like, if we are going to start to get into, talking about the ins and outs of the nervous system, right? The parasympathetic branch of our nervous system, right, has that sort of collapse, overwhelm, hopeless, helpless, dynamic. And that's where, like, shame is part of that.
Yes. Yeah. So like, if we have the attitude, or if, like, I mean, it's normal to feel some shame in our culture around having trauma. We might have received the messaging that somehow if we're traumatized, we're broken, right? Which might then lead to feeling shame about it. But as we normalize it, and we're like, no, nothing's wrong with you if you have trauma. Right? Like, you're not broken or unfixable if you have trauma. Trauma is part of being a human, right? That like recognizing and actually accepting that can really help not like traumatize ourselves even further.
Yeah. The experience of shame can be so painful that it triggers a nervous system response.
Yes.
Right. It's like the shame is traumatic.
Yes. Right. Exactly. And I think you've put it this way, like it's part of our humanity, right?
Yeah.
To have these experiences. But I also like to think about it as it's part of our animal creatureness. Like it's part of our like primal / more modernly evolved like animal creature system, right? It's in our physiology. It's not something wrong with our physiology. It's actually something that's working properly most of the time when it at least initiates the trauma. So this is my next question for you, right? Is like I'm curious about your take on this. Is if we have these two wings, which is actually a little more complicated, right? There's the sympathetic, that fight or flight, and then there's the parasympathetic, like survival mode, which is like the freeze, right? And I'm curious about, like, if you want to say a little bit more about those, and then ultimately I want to hear a little bit about how you see those as like how those, when we're in one or the other, or even both. Sometimes there can be like the foot on the brake and the foot on the gas. And
we are not simple creatures.
Yeah, no, it's very complex.
We
right?
But having all the responses, and You know, I mean, it's in simplistic ways, we can say that women tend to default into a parasympathetic because we know that fighting isn't going to work for us.
Makes so much sense biologically.
Fight,
yeah.
Right. But like, of course we do, right? We get angry.
Right.
Or we want to run away.
Yes.
But yeah, and then there's, that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are sort of considered the mammalian animal aspects of our nervous system. Plus, I mean, they're human too, but it's the human, and what do they even call it now? The sort of like the newest, which they call the ventral vagal.
The ventral vagal system. Yeah, exactly. The smart vagus, in other words. Yeah.
And it's funny because then, the parasympathetic is also now called the dorsal vagal.
Yes.
Right. And the sympathetic stays the sympathetic. I don't know why, but like.
It's fascinating to look at an image of the nervous system pathways, literally the nerves. It's really an interesting thing for those of you who are actually like intrigued by the anatomy of it. As
mammals evolved.
Yeah.
And then as humans came along, that nerve, the vagus nerve, it has branches into our face.
Yes. It's so fascinating.
Right. And I learned a lot of this from listening to Stephen Porges, but, right. So that we can, scan the environment, scan a room and see people's faces. And we, just like slight differences in a face will tell us, oh, that person is upset or that person's happy or, whatever. And constantly gauging like, oh, is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe?
Yeah. And this is like, so for highly sensitive people, like we're especially good at picking up those nuances.
Yes.
So it's like, we could just everybody has this capacity, but there's a heightened capacity in highly sensitive people to do this. So it's pretty fascinating. Right.
But what I love is that just like we have for the parasympathetic, we talk about rest and digest. What I love is that for the social engagement ventral vagal system, there is a term called tend and befriend.
Yes.
Which is, and that is often seen as a very womanly, female thing. But that is that it's, and I guess if you were to say, with the parasympathetic, when everything's healthy, we're resting and digesting, we're doing all these things. And in threat, right, then we start to become overwhelmed and confused. And, the more the threat and the more dysregulated we become, right, then it's fainting and collapsing and all freezing.
Yeah.
Dissociating.
Yes.
And with the social nervous system, I love that, they've now coined the term, and I've seen actually now two terms, fawning or feigning, Figning. But so like, so when it becomes more threatening, instead of tending and befriending, that's where people pleasing comes in. Right. And rolling over and letting people take advantage of you and all that.
Yes.
Right. To stay safe.
Right. Which is something we've been talking about a lot recently on the podcast. So I'm glad you brought that up. Just the idea of like people pleasing and like rolling over and yeah. So there's so many different ways, like our nervous system dictates so much of our feelings and our behaviors. I'm really curious specifically about like if we look at freeze, right, and you've shared that this might be a little bit more our female tendency. It's almost like when we can't fight or flee, we freeze, right? Yeah. It's like almost the extreme response, and it can tend to happen. I see it a lot with my female clients, and what that could feel like let's just pull that out a little bit, is like dissociation, right? Like I know that one so well. Feelings of confusion, despair, like you said earlier, shame, right?
Yep.
I want to share like one of my tendency is to go into fight like more in my relationships, especially with my like, that's been my normal place to go more quickly. Which is more like, that shows up more as like fight, right? Anger, like anxiety, like the normal feelings of like stress, like blood pumping hard, heart pumping hard, like irritability, right?
Yeah.
Like wanting to lash out. I know not all women tend to go there as quickly, but that tends to be my like, right? My first. But then what I've noticed is, this doesn't happen to me nearly as often as it used to in my relationship with my husband. But if like we're having a discussion that becomes more of an intense disagreement or like conflict and emotions have gotten strong, that's when I'll start to dissociate, right? I'll hit that like parasympathetic freeze, where it's just like, I feel so flooded. I can't think clearly. Like I can't remember anything that I just said or he just said.
Yes. Yep.
Right. Yeah. So that's part of how that parasympathetic freeze shows up in my experience. What about you? What do you think freeze might look like in relationships?
Well, I focus more on the mother-daughter thing.
Yeah.
And what I recognized, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago was, oh, my mom's default is fight. When she feels unsafe, right, she gets angry.
Yeah.
Or threatened. And it's interesting because I started to realize that in a lot of ways, I threaten her.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I'm like, me? Like, what? I'm so easygoing. But it's interesting because I think she doesn't like that about me. And I'm like my father. She divorced when I was 2, right? So,
and that's so interesting. Just want to pause you there. Like, I want to reiterate this point is like, so much of our threat, the experience that we have in our own systems as threat, comes from our perceptions, not from the reality necessarily of what's happening out there.
Yes. Yeah. And it's like, and we can, in this, I know our conversation is very multi-layered here.
Yes.
But, right. That like, we can then shame ourselves for, like, I know logically there's no threat here, but like my body is acting like it. And that's like terrible. It shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
Like what's wrong with me that logically I know, but anyway. Right. But yeah, my experience of that freeze state is self-numbing, distracting myself. But also I very much relate to what you said about like not being able to access my words.
Yes.
Feeling stupid, right?
Yeah.
Crumpling in on myself, just wanting to disappear.
Yes.
And it's funny because like, that's why when I think about if you think about like a lizard, right, which is the best example of a freeze animal, right? I don't think that, they will play dead, which is freezing, but it's like not something that they think about. It's like the body just does it.
Takes over. Yep.
Yeah. But as humans, right, we have a cascade or a continuum or of like, here's what I say to myself. Like, if I notice myself starting to feel slightly confused or slightly overwhelmed, which are hopeless and helpless. Yeah. Those are clues to me.
Yes.
That's what's happening.
Yeah.
So yeah. And with my mom and me, right, she goes into fight, I go into freeze or people pleasing. Less so. I don't do that as much anymore, but I notice now, in fact, I was visiting her about a month or so ago, and to me, this was a really good example of having done my work. And that is that at a certain point, I got up and left. and I was very conscious of it. I was feeling the threat, like the threat response.
Yes.
And I honored it in a way that was, in a way that I liked and respected.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
I love that.
And like being able to, and I think that for me, just learning about the nervous system and like, when we talk about healing and repairing and all of that, it's like, well, what does it look like? How do you know, you have smoothed over this trauma?
Yeah.
And to me, I see it as very incremental and small, and it doesn't require much.
Yes.
In order to catch yourself sooner.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
And to like, another thing that I think is important to understand is that, especially for those of us who are in the mode of like marketing ourselves,
mm-hmm.
we're told, just do it, go for it, jump, big jump in the pool, make a big splash, right? And then you're like, what? That was like too much for my system.
Yes.
And so, but it's like we can increase, and I love the terminology of expanding capacity.
Yes, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? It's like just make it slightly bigger so that I can hold a little bit more.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I like, well, part of what I'm hearing you saying, I actually call a lot of this like developing sensitive awareness, right, of ourselves. Like that's a piece of being able to work with the trauma/nervous system stress responses, right? It's such a big, important piece. And I think even you and I, as we talk about this together today, for people who don't know much about this, or we're helping them develop more sensitive awareness of their own system. So even just like taking in this information is helpful. Everybody out there listening, like for you to develop awareness of your own stress or trauma responses, right? To start to understand, oh, like this is what's happening. This is what's happening. It's not a terrible thing. It's not something's not terribly wrong with you, right? This part of the nervous system is taking over this part, right? That's so helpful because then you can start to track that more inside of yourself.
Yeah.
And that's a piece of the healing. So on that note, one of my questions is, just want to touch on this once more or slightly more. And then I want to dive into some of the ways we can, continue this healing process or accelerate it. The sympathetic, like fight or flight response. Again, I'm just curious, like, I would love just so listeners can understand how that might look when that's triggered or activated, the survival piece of that response in a relationship.
Feelings of annoyance and frustration and irritation is like on the lower end, right? Like you start to notice you're rolling your eyes or something, right? Right. Or like, oh geez.
Yeah.
Right. And then moving on up into like full-blown anger.
Yes.
And rage, right? Yes. Like for me, what I call it at the very top is white hot rage.
Yes.
And I think it's important, and I don't know if this is like accurate or not, but I like this distinction. There's the difference to me between anger and rage is that rage includes action, some often violent action. Whereas anger, it can,
that's interesting.
It doesn't necessarily. And, women have a kind of a weird relationship to anger and what's appropriate. And, it's funny. I heard something recently that said, we could fix the world if we let women feel angry and men feel sad.
Oh, that's so good. Yes, totally.
Totally. So yeah, those to me are like the clues or cues, right? Is starting off.
Yeah. And sorry. Yeah. I was just like an image of someone I've been working with recently came to my mind of just, and this is a classic example of like the fight or flight is it can come from something as simple as like the hubby, like shutting down or being quiet for a while because he's stressed out or something. And that longing that so many of us as women, at least many of my clients, have for connection and interaction. And if they're not getting that, that can be a cue for, that stress response to happen and swell that anger up. Right. Mm-hmm. And then you might find like you don't even notice the anger. You just notice that you're like yelling or criticizing your husband.
Yes. In mother-daughter relationships, like speaking for myself, because I don't just always go into freeze mode. I get angry too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's so funny. People are like, oh my God, they feel like they're the only ones when they say something like this. They're like, I just wish she would die. Like, right. That's okay. It's normal to sometimes feel that way.
Right.
About their mothers. But, it's passive aggressive. There's, I also sort of like to look at these kinds of responses from the perspective of like emotionally mature and emotionally immature.
Yeah.
Not to say, oh, you're so immature and you're bad. There's clean and dirty anger, mature and immature anger.
Yes.
And, immature anger, right? Passive aggressiveness, manipulating.
I even think like complaining.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All of those kinds of things. Also feeling like poor me.
Yeah. Self-pity, victim-y. Yeah, totally. Any of these things lead to the opposite of connection with our person, with our mother, with our with our significant other, right? And oftentimes what ends up happening in relationships is like it's just two nervous systems interacting instead of two human beings.
Yeah.
Right? I remember you saying that, and it's true. It's like it's not the like conscious, like more evolved part of ourselves that are interacting when we get taken over by our stress responses. It's our primal nervous systems, right? Or our long ago evolved parts of ourselves, not our more modern evolved parts.
That was very, recognizing that in my relationship with my mom was very helpful because even though, as I said, like there are times where I don't want to access my higher self. And I can see I can sometimes see myself being in a like, rather than like, oh, I'm evolved here.
Yeah.
But recognizing like, oh yes, we're now two nervous systems, not our more connected selves interacting here. It helps me not trigger my mom. Right. Yes. There's times where I'm like, it would be fun to trigger her.
Right. Which is totally okay if we choose to do that.
I know better. Right. And I try to do better. But like before I knew that, I didn't know. Right. I just thought like, why is she so angry all the time? Right.
Yeah. Part of the healing of our trauma and handling our nervous system responses is a movement towards connection, if that makes sense. So I want to read the definition that Stephen Porges has for trauma. I'm sure he has lots of definitions, right? But one of them is trauma is chronic disruption of connectedness. Right. And so and at the same time, when we're in, like I said a minute ago, like when we're in those responses, we aren't able to connect as well. Right. But one of the ways that I've taken this through my studies of trauma is that we can actually start to really begin to unwind and heal trauma through compassionate connection, or like the befriending, or with that like tending and soothing of our own systems, like a turning towards, in other words, like building a healthy, kind relationship with our nervous system responses. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
As we do that, we open ourselves up to more and more and better quality connection with other people.
Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because, my relationship with my mom is very much a work in progress. It's not perfect.
Yeah.
I sometimes I think that the word connected and passion and, kind, like we think that means that it looks a certain way. And like, oh, if we're connected, that means that we have these deep, intimate
Oh,
conversations.
right. Totally.
Like, you know, and
Yeah.
we're, holding hands and walking under the
Yeah.
rainbow.
Right.
And that isn't always possible. And again, I know, for your clients, and it's about a romantic relationship, and in mine, it's not a romantic relationship. It's very different.
Yeah.
But it is one of the things I've recognized is that the more a woman, an adult daughter can connect to herself, her values, her, the traits that she holds dear, and to stop blaming herself, shaming herself, more self-acceptance, more self-trust, like all of that. She feels safer in herself.
Yes, exactly.
And then she can connect to her mom.
Yes.
But it may not look because of, and again, I don't mean to say like all mothers are bad or all mothers are not evolved or not capable. But generally in, the mother-daughter relationships that I see, the mother isn't going to get to that place in herself. So like the daughter can be.
Right. Yeah.
And that's great. And that gives more room for connection, but it doesn't necessarily look equal, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I actually think there's sometimes in marriages, that's true. Not always, right? But sometimes that's also true, is like, as the woman develops more safety and all of this that you were talking about, it doesn't necessarily reflect in the husband doing the exact same in himself, right? And therefore being able to like walk in rainbows, right? As you were saying. But there's a different capacity for authenticity, right?
Yeah.
And to me, authenticity and presence are so much about what connection is about. Connection with others can oftentimes extend from this ability to quote unquote connect with ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it's bringing it back to trauma and our nervous system responses is part of the ways that we can begin to move the needle on that and kind of unwind it or heal it. In other words, I think about this. So tell me what you think. Being there for ourselves. Again, having the sensitive awareness, learning our nervous system responses, and then kind of being there for ourselves, like a kind but somewhat authoritative, right? Sort of strong, like you said, mama bear, like mama for ourselves. I don't know if this is going to work for you with your mama, with the mother daughter. But yeah, like being our own mother in a way.
And I've had to learn how to do that, and I'm still learning. And I love this example because it's relatively recent. And speaking back about, body image and how I look.
Yeah.
This was like, I don't know, 3-4 months ago. I caught myself looking at myself in the mirror with disgust. And I know that I have looked at myself in the mirror with disgust before, but I didn't notice it.
Yes.
And I noticed it. And I was like, that fierce mama bear energy came out. And I was like, oh, no. You don't do that to you.
Yes.
You don't look at yourself that way. You don't know. Like, that's not okay. Right.
Yeah.
I wasn't like angry at myself. It was like, it's making me tear up just a little bit, just thinking. It was so tender. And so like, that's what that's how I mom myself. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
I remember being in a yoga class many years ago, and the instructor said this, and I've used it many times: take yourself onto your own lap. And I'm like, yes, that's another, and something to say here is, if you can associate like a thought or a image, right, with a felt sense, right, with that tenderness or that fierceness, it like has more of a impact, or like it's more significant, I think, in terms of being able to remember versus like positive affirmations, which, okay, those can be great, but like I've also heard like, a positive affirmation without like that felt.
No, the feeling's so important.
Yeah, it's like somebody said it's like putting a smiley face on a gas tank and expecting to go 100 miles. It's like, right? Like you have to have the fuel of the emotion.
Yes. 100%. Yeah. That's so good.
Yeah. Or go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say something that was coming to mind through that is like, I talked about connection, but really when we're, I call it sometimes shepherding our nervous system too, what we're talking about a little bit, right? Like guiding our nervous system back into that more calm, connect, tend to befriend, healthy spot. That, what was I going to say? See, now I'm dissociating. It's just what happens to us humans.
Yep.
Oh yeah, the feeling, right? We're guiding. What we're going for, what we're wanting to guide ourselves back to, is the safety, right?
Yeah,
the felt sense of safety. And there's so many ways to do that, right? What you were just sharing is one way. Yeah, a little taste of a way. And I know that I'm planning on doing a podcast all about like what I call body-based interventions, right? Which is just like ways to bring ourselves back towards safety, really.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific, like one or two more little tips in that realm to help people?
Yeah, I actually shared one on Simone's podcast. It was that chanting. And I won't do that here, but it's interesting because that one actually is about more moving into the sympathetic. It's about taking this out of a freeze response, right? Or a parasympathetic response.
And I think that's an important distinction, right? Is just, that's part of why we want the sensitive awareness of like, oh, am I going to the freeze or am I going to the fight or flight? Because when we can recognize we're going to freeze, we might know, oh, we might need some more sympathetic energy here.
Right. Like, how can I move this energy?
Yes.
Right.
Whereas if we're like in super fight or flight, we might want to move back towards the calmer, like not to freeze, but more slow.
But I mean, some of my favorites are like, one of my favorites, this so simple, like the simplest thing in the world. And I will just demonstrate it now.
Yeah.
My name is Karen. It is Thursday, September 30th, and I am sitting in my office in Waterford, Connecticut, and I'm talking with Hannah on this podcast. I'm just sort of locating in the here and now. I am here. I know where I am. I can see around me, right? And then, that is just a verbalization. But then being able to look out and like orient myself in my space and what is in my space. And when I look out the window, how far can I see? Right.
Yes. I love that you're bringing this one up, because this is the one that I was going to share too, is orienting. Yeah. Just like, right. You're just like, like looking around the room, right? Or looking out the window and seeing what's here now in this moment. And as long as there's not like tigers in your room, right? Like
I have a very small tiger in my room right now. He's a black and white tiger named Bella. But the
hi, Bella.
She's like wants to meow. But like you were talking before about the vagus nerve. And one way to sort of stimulate, I guess, I don't know if it's the right word, but is to turn in your seat. Like if you keep your feet, your legs facing forward, and you twist at the waist, and then you twist at the neck, and you cut your eyes, not so far that it hurts, but like to look behind you. It's like every time I do it, I am like shocked at like how it feels in my body. To turn and look behind me. But like it's about our perception of where we are in space,
Mhm.
like where is my body in space? What's inside my body? How does it feel inside my body? How
Mm.
does my body perceive its position in space? Right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
all these perceptions that we have the ability to play with
Yes.
and increase and, practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that just reminds me of what I was saying earlier is like, it's in a way that's a way of connecting back to yourself, right? You're like, oh, where am I? I'm here. My body's here. Right. It's like, oh, just it's that awareness of self.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard it described like, you can close your eyes and take your finger and put it on your nose. That's like an example that
Mm.
you know where you are.
Mm. Oh, yeah. Interesting. Well, I have a couple things if people want some other further learnings around this. One of my favorite practices is that works for this, that helps with the stress responses and the trauma responses, is what I call wink. It's a self-compassion / self-awareness practice. And I shared it in episode 4. So that's a good one to go back to for that practice. It's just the introduction to that practice. And then I think there's what I've called the mind, body, heart slump episode, that highly sensitive person, mind, body, heart slump. It's like probably below number 10, maybe a little higher than that in the episodes. That's a great one also that shares some other tools to help with everything that Karen and I have been talking about today. Any final thoughts, Karen?
No, I mean, thank you. I love talking about this. I love that, there's just more and more awareness and willingness to talk about this, not from like some lofty clinical place, but like from real world experience, because we are humans that, have bodies and nervous systems, and
Absolutely.
talk about it and be like, oh yeah, it's normal, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I'm so glad to have had this conversation with you. This is such a beautiful and interesting, fascinating realm to me too, to talk about. But it doesn't have to be overly complex to actually move it in our lives and make some change in our own lives, right? And I think that's really important. It's about just choosing to like explore a couple little ways of what I call shepherding your nervous system, or being that sort of mama to your own system.
Yeah. I love that. It's and again, it doesn't have to be a big, huge change, right? This is not about like fixing you.
Right.
It's like knowing you and tending you. And like the other analogy I like is imagining a massive ocean liner coming across the ocean, say from like England, and the captain of the ship only has to make a 1 degree change in order to go, like if they was originally going to New York City, it now is going to go to like Florida or whatever, but it's only a 1 degree change.
Yes.
So that's to me what like this nervous system, just doing 1 or 2 of these like little things almost seem like nothing. It doesn't require like hours of meditation and
Exactly. Yeah. It's such an important point too. And that it isn't necessarily about like eliminating trauma. It's more about like what we call is like introducing more flexibility to our system, right? Like teaching ourselves to like be able to move out of it. Right. And then it will go back into it. And then moving out, like just knowing how to gently shepherd ourselves out of it.
Yeah. We flow.
We flow. It's about flow. I love it. So good. Well, thank you so much, Karen. Do you want to share what the best places that people can find you?
Yeah.
Do you want to know more?
My website is www.kclanderson.com. And, from there you can sign up for my newsletter if you want to, or, find me on social media, all those kinds of things.
All the things. Beautiful.
Awesome.
Well, yeah. Thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And to everyone listening out there, be oh so well.